And so with Bodhichitta motivation, then we can do the verse of refuge from Bodhichitta. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Through the merits of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Through the merits of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Through the merits of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. Good to see everybody. Maybe I'll start just a quick comment about just having taken refuge just now. I think I was thinking about from last time and sort of as one of the commentaries too, but sometimes they differentiate, right? Like being Buddhist or practice, or how did I say it last time in Tibetan, the word nangba, like insider or something. Like in terms of conduct, they say it's determined by taking refuge, right? So in other words, a person who takes refuge and tries not to harm others is, practicing the Buddha Dharma through conduct. Right? And then another way of differentiating a Buddhist is to say through view, right? And that would be the person who holds to the, the four seals. So and sometimes they differentiate that. Like often Tibetan lamas, Tibetan geshes and lamas will say that in terms of they'll sometimes differentiate. Like for example, in Tibetan culture, there are a lot of people, there were traditionally a lot of people who were not literate, right, and wouldn't have known the four seals, would have never heard the four seals. So those people would have been, for example, Buddhist in terms of conduct, because they took refuge, right? They would recite the refuge formula and sort of try to practice, non-harm and recite mantras and so on. So they'd be Buddhist in terms of conduct, but their view wouldn't be Buddhist because they wouldn't understand what those, they wouldn't know about necessarily the four seals. And then somebody who holds to the four seals would be considered Buddhist if you hold to the four seals or something, then you're Buddhist in both ways. Because then you have some and part of the point there is that if you understand the four seals, then you have some beginning at least of understanding of what are the three jewels, right? What are the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, deeper understanding. Anyway, so that's one way of differentiating that point. And then one other thing I wanted to share, actually, just from because it related to last time, is the third of the four seals, right, which says all phenomena are empty and selfless. I was sort of thinking about that when I was like, because what's there? Say this right. The word empty, right? Like, in other words, of course, we're studying tenets, and so people who belong, people who follow the lower, like the Vaibashikas that we're studying, they would not, they would disagree with the Madhyamaka view of what emptiness is. But I was sort of going back, but they do use this phrase, empty and selfless. And so I was trying to remember what they mean by that. And I was like, oh yeah, okay. So I wanted to just clarify that point. That for them, actually, make sure I say it right. I wrote it down to make sure. Okay, so empty comes first and then selfless. So for them, and we're going to get into this in detail as we study the Vaibashikas, but for them, empty means empty of a permanent, unitary, independent self. And then selfless for them means empty of a self-sufficient, substantially existent self. And I'll make a general point. For all the schools, actually, for all the different tenet systems, other than the Middleway consequence school, other than the Prasangikas, like all the schools teach a coarse selflessness of persons, which is the first one I just mentioned. So the coarse selflessness of persons is that there's no permanent, unitary, independent self or person. And they all say that the subtle selflessness of persons is that there's no self-sufficient, substantially existent person. The Prasangikas differ on that. For them, what other schools call the subtle selflessness of persons, right, that lack of a self-sufficient, substantially existent person, for the Prasangikas, that's gross selflessness. And then they present a different idea of what subtle selflessness is. And, you know, I was sort of pausing and thinking, I wanted to say a general comment too, as I was thinking about this, right? So just thinking about that, right? Like, you know, and I was thinking like in the monasteries, they memorize, right? So they would memorize these categories and these, that's good, what Paul said. He's having a hard time understanding the difference. That's good. That's what I was getting at here. In other words, they memorize these terms, right? You know, and we have to memorize them too if we're going to study this in any detail, right? But then the next thing we have to do, and I hope we'll start doing this over these next now few weeks, starting really, is to really contemplate that, right? To contemplate, what does that mean? Does that make sense? Like, what does it mean that there, just pick one, right? What does it mean that there's not a permanent self? And why is there not a permanent self? Like, what would be the reasoning to support that? Why is there not a unitary self? You know, so you have to contemplate those things, because, you know, first you have to know what the words are, but then you have to contemplate, well, what does that mean? And is it true or is it not true? Right? And just because the Buddha said it's true that's not sufficient, right, to prove that it's true. So we have to check for ourselves. And another point here is like, and this, I've said this in a general way before, but now we're going to start getting into detail, is like the different schools mean different things by that to some extent, first of all. And also, we have to be able to understand the difference, right, between that there is not a permanent, unitary, independent self, and that's different from there not being a self-sufficient, substantially existent self. And that's different from, and if you can't tell it, what's the difference between there not being a self-sufficient, substantially existent self and there not being an inherently existent self, right, that the Prasangikas assert. And part of my point is, if we don't know the difference, if we can't tell the difference between those, you know, like I think Lama Tsongkhapa would say, then saying we're studying, and then if you say, oh, I'm a proponent of the Madhyamaka, has no meaning actually, right? Like, because if you don't know the unique features of the Madhyamaka, then how can you be a practitioner of the Madhyamaka? So, so we're going to kind of get into detail about what are the differences between those things as we kind of go along. But I just thought to kind of say that in a general way, right? So, so when we say empty, so in terms of the four seals, though, when we say empty and selfless, and actually you'll see as we go into this, though, like even that we'd have to debate, and I'll say why. Like as we get into the Vaibashika school, the Vaibashika schools, there are 18 sub-schools of the Vaibashika, and 17 of them agree that there is both no permanent, unitary, and independent self, and that there's no substantially existent self-sufficient self. But one of those schools agrees with the first of those statements, but doesn't agree with the second. So then you could ask, are they Buddhist, according to this, right? Or do they accept all four of the seals, or do they not accept half of one of the seals? And that's a point that like, Buddhist teachers debate. So we can sort of get and I'm just say something too, like we raise these issues partly because if we think about them, then our understanding of those points deepens, right? And if you could understand why would that school, which we'll get into in a little while today, hopefully, but why would that school not refute a substantially, they would refute a permanent, and actually because Paul said it's hard to tell the difference. So if you actually, which I agree with, sometimes that is hard. But if you study that school a bit, if you contemplate what that school's saying, then you go, wait a second, they accept one but not the other, so they must be different. How are they different? Why does that school accept one and not the other? And even if we don't agree with that school in the end, by studying that school, you start to get a flavor for what's the difference between those two. Does that make sense? So it's really useful to study these different schools, because then you start to, by studying them, you start to see, oh, this is what this one means by that. That's what that one means by that. And then as you do that, you start to see, well, okay, now I can see the differences between these different kinds of self in this case, right? And then you can work on how do you refute those kinds of self. So that's a general point. And then I wanted to make one other general point that actually I was, like when I do these kinds of classes, I usually review like, the root text, of course, which we're studying, Jetsun Chogi Gyaltsen's root text. But then I look at, like, usually, in this case, I chose 3 Geshe's transcripts to kind of relate to this. And then I'll look at I have all these different books about tenets. But one point that it was interesting to me, all the Geshes seem to, I think all the Geshes at the beginning, they all said the same thing. And I was sort of thinking about it. And what they basically say is like, this is hard. They'll say, studying Buddhist philosophy is not easy. If you're really getting into the details of it. And then one of them, though, said, so Geshe Choni, he's like the abbot of Kopan. And he said something interesting, I thought. He said, but to study these topics, he said it has more benefit karmically or something. Yeah, karmically, I guess, than making 100,000 prostrations or 100,000 mandala offerings. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. Right? And he was saying, because if you're studying this, you're creating imprints of the Buddha's teaching, right? And you're creating imprints of emptiness for understanding emptiness. And that, and actually, Kensei Rinpoche always says that, doesn't he? Whenever he teaches emptiness, he always at the beginning does this like long section where he talks about the incredible benefits, right? And the point being, like, they say that, right? Filling all these examples like that. If you could fill as many, I always think that's amazing, isn't it? That like when Buddhism, when they say, imagine the number of grains of sand. Actually, they say, one commentary said when they say by the river Ganges, what they actually mean is all the sand on the planet. One commentary said that. So you imagine like how many grains of sand there are on this planet. And then they say, imagine that many planets, which of course there are, right? There are that many planets. I mean, in the universe, more than that. And then they say, imagine filling all of those with gold and silver and diamonds and pearls and sapphires and so on, and offering them to the Buddha, and then it says, studying emptiness sincerely creates more merit than that. So it's like, they always say that. And so what Geshe Choni was saying is what Kensei Rinpoche says, is what the Buddha said, is what the sutras say. So that's useful, I think, to think about, though, that even, that this is, it's not an easy, obviously studying emptiness is not easy, but that there is great merit in doing so. Okay, so that was that part. And then, one other general comment I wanted to make. I just don't want to skip over these things. And this is just a general comment for people who are interested in this kind of thing. But so, we're still on page 2 of the text, Jetsun Chogi Gyaltsen's text. And I just wanted to go through. So we said there are 4 schools of tenets, 4 tenet divisions. And so there's the Vaibashika, which is translated as Great Exposition, Proponents of Great Exposition. There's the Great Exposition School. There's the Sutra School, Sartantrikas, the Mind Only or Chittamatra School, and the Middleway or Madhyamaka School. Right? And one point I just wanted to mention is that you can also categorize those 4 schools in terms of that people often talk about the 3 turnings of the wheel of Dharma, right? They say that the Buddha had 3 turnings of the wheel of Dharma. And so the first turning of the wheel of Dharma, right, was the Buddha's teaching of the 4 Noble Truths, which began in Deer Park, right? In the Deer Park, in Stravasti. And so we could say the first 2 tenet systems, the Great Exposition, so the Vaibashika, and the Sartantrika, the Sutra School, those are people who hold those tenets. The way they sometimes say it is, the first turning wheel of Dharma was mainly to benefit beings of those dispositions. That's the way they sometimes say it. So it wasn't that there weren't bodhisattvas there and weren't madhyamikas there, but the main audience of the first turning the wheel of Dharma were people who had the karmic predisposition, you could say, or the need for the Vaibashika and Satantrika school. And the main topic of that turning of the wheel of Dharma was the Four Noble Truths. And again, all Buddhists study and practice the Four Noble Truths, but let's say right. But the followers of those two tenet systems, that's the main, their main focus, the main topic for them. Then now you'll see they go out of order, right? So that's the first turning of the Dharma. Now we jump to the third turning, right? That the mind-only school, people who have the predisposition to practice and sort of need the teaching of the mind-only school were the main audience of the third turning of the wheel of Dharma, which emphasized the three natures, which we'll get into when we study the mind-only school, what the three natures are. And oftentimes we say the third turning of the Dharma also emphasized the point of Buddha nature, right? The teachings on Buddha nature. And then the Middleway School, right, which is the fourth of these tenet schools, they were the main audience of the second turning of the wheel of Dharma, which taught the Prajnaparamita, which is emphasize the main scriptures of that are the Prajnaparamita sutras, right? And they sometimes say that the main subject of that second turning wheel of Dharma is emptiness, or the teaching of non-nature, teaching that there is no inherent nature, things like that. The Heart Sutra is an example of that. Some of you there, we studied that. So the fourth. So you go. Yeah. So the first two relate to the first turning of the wheel of Dharma, right? The third school, the mind-only school, relates to the third turning of the wheel of Dharma. And finally, the Madhyamaka, the Middleway School, relates mainly, we're the main audience of the second turning of the wheel of Dharma, the Prajnaparamita Sutras. So anyway, that's just another way of looking at those four schools. So, because oftentimes many of you know what the three turnings of the wheel of Dharma, so here we can relate them to these different tenet systems. With that, maybe, actually, is there? Yeah, with that, maybe I'll turn now to the Vaibashika, or Great Exposition, to that school. And I'll make a general point first. So that starts for those everybody can have the text, so it's available. So I'll just make a general point first. You'll see at the top of page 3 there are 7 points for the outline. I always note that, right? Tibetan texts by scholars always have many outlines, and many points of outline and sub-outlines and things like that. If you study Tibetan Buddhism especially with any geshe, then you're familiar with outlines. Sometimes the outlines are I've had that experience. Did you ever have that? Sometimes the outlines seem almost impossible, where they're I don't know, it's subcategory of the subcategory. You get down to the 8th or 9th subcategory sometimes, and it's I can't sometimes follow how many where you are in the bigger category and so on. But anyway, this one's fairly simple because every school is going to have these same 7 points. So this is not a difficult one, right? So if you think of, in one way, we're going to study 4 different schools, and each school is going to have these same 7 ways they're presented, right? With the definition, the divisions, the etymology, the way of asserting objects, the way of asserting object possessors. That means subjects, right? Object possessors in Buddhism means a subject, a mind, a consciousness that apprehends something. Their way of asserting selflessness, and their presentation of the grounds and paths to progress, right? So those are the 7. I'm just reading them off here, but those are the 7 categories. So we're going to look at those same 7 general categories for each tenet system, and in that way, the reason why I think that's quite good, right? That it's the same 7, because that way we can compare and contrast them. If that makes sense, we'll be able to kind of look at the same category for each one and say, oh, these are the differences, these are the similarities, these are what they have in common, and these are the unique things that make them different than the other schools. So that's useful. So, okay, that's that. And I'll go in order here. I'll just follow the order of the text for a bit. Just make sure I'm not skipping something. Oops. Okay, so we'll start with the definition. That's the first of the 7 points. So here it says, the definition of proponent of the Great Exposition is a person propounding lesser vehicle, Hinayana tenets, who does not assert self-knowers, but does assert truly established external objects. That's the way Jetson Chogi Gelsen defines proponent of the Great Exposition School. So let's just go through that definition. So first of all, there are 3 elements to the definition, right? As Jetson Chogi Gelsen gives it. And so the first element is a person propounding lesser vehicle, or Hinayana, in Sanskrit, Hinayana tenets. So I want to pause there to reflect just on that first element. And actually, I want to start, though, reflecting that one by saying, just even this phrase, right? Sometimes I kind of struggle with this in the sense, this phrase, Hinayana tenets, right? I want to point out something. Some of you know this already, and some may not, so it's worth just spending a minute on. I saw this, this idea of this phrase, lesser vehicle or Hinayana. Of course, only Mahayanists call Hinayanists, right? Nobody self-identifies. It's kind of funny, right? Because nobody really self-identifies. I'm lesser, and my Dharma is lesser. And so I sometimes struggle with that, and I was sort of contemplating it, and there are many, many other people who have brought this up. And, sometimes it's a little struggle, because sometimes people substitute, right? I've noticed this in Europe and America, people sometimes will say, well, Theravada, right? But as we're about to see, Theravada is just one of the 18 sub-schools of this Theravada. So not all proponents of the not all Vaibashikas, I'm just going to use that phrase, are Theravadan, because Theravada is only one of 18 schools of Vaibhashika. So sometimes people use this phrase, oh, they're Theravada, right? Which means, usually I think that's translated like the elders, way of the elders or something. But that's not actually, using the term Theravada is not exactly accurate, because Theravada is only one of 18 sub-schools of this. So to say these are all, and then also the followers of the Sutra school, the Sautantrikas, would also be, from a Mahayana perspective, Hinayana, but they're definitely not Theravadins. So to use the word Theravada is, I think, problematic. Hinayana is kind of a Mahayana, slightly, maybe, could have a pejorative connotation. Sometimes the Dalai Lama says Pali tradition, right? He'll say the Pali tradition. Sometimes he'll refer to that way, which is accurate if you're referring to, the schools that follow the Pali canon. But that's not inclusive of everybody, right? Because there are, for example, when you study the Vasubandhu's Abhidharma Kosha, that's a Sanskrit text that's propounding Vaibashika. So, if you just say Pali tradition, that doesn't include all Vaibashikas either. So that's not an inclusive term. And so I was like, so one way of saying it, one text I was reading used the phrase followers of the Shravaka Yana and Prajika Buddha Yana. And I thought that's probably the most beautiful way to put it, right? Because, in other words, if you think about it, what it really means is it's the vehicle. When Mahayana say lesser vehicle, what is really referring to here, right, are those who follow the vehicle of the listeners, the hearers, which is Shravaka, right? That's the Sanskrit phrase Shravaka means listener or hearer, right? Who are striving to become like the Arhat, the great Arhats of the Buddha's time were Shravakas, right? Shariputra, Mahamagayana, and so on. And then the other vehicle, you could say, that when Mahayanas say Hinayana, would be the Prajika Buddhayana, right? Which means a solitary realizer, which we'll get into what those mean, but that's part of the tenets of these. So I don't know which phrase we'll use for our discussion, but I just wanted to say that. I sort of say, so really when we say, when this definition here says a person propounding lesser vehicle tenets, it's referring to somebody who's propounding tenets that were mainly taught for those who follow the vehicle, who are mainly seek. And so the main issue here, who are mainly seeking, who are mainly following the Shravaka, the vehicle of the listeners, or the vehicle of the Prajika Buddhas, of the solitary realizers, solitary realizer, we could say. And then I wanted to kind of reflect on something also. Yeah, I said that, I could leave this out, but I part of the, like, I said, whatever. I hope that, actually, Khensa Rinpoche sometimes asks this when he teaches. So sort of pausing to think about it. Like, he sometimes, when Khensa Rinpoche sometimes teaches, it's funny, when he used to teach often at Guya Samadhi Center, he would say, I don't know, some of you were, well, Jeff was there, a few of you were there when he would do this. He would, at the beginning, he would often say, well, should I just do like the general simple way, or should I give the details? That's what he would often say. And a number of us would shout out always, please give the detail. We sort of jump up, probably jumping out of our seats. So I'm just pausing to realize some of these points, like, the next point would be like a detail point that I could leave out, but I guess, I don't know. Are you okay with me including that? Jody says, leave it out, I think. Should I leave this out, or it'll be too confusing? I'll go ahead and this one I'll do, and then I'll let you guys vote. Maybe we should keep doing these side points. But I'll do the first side point. Jody, you want to say that?
Don't leave them out. We need.
Don't leave them out. Okay. I just want to reflect on this. So, we say here, a person propounding lesser vehicle tenets, right? Or a person propounding the tenets of the Shravakas and the Prajika Buddhas. So this is kind of, I find this kind of thing fun a bit, but so that person, right, who's propounding these tenets, there are 4 possibilities. We'll go through now. Regarding like a person who, so in other words, if you think about lesser vehicle, I'm just going to use that phrase because it's in the text for a moment. So a person could be a lesser vehicle practitioner, but not propound lesser vehicle tenets. Actually, I'll just say all 4, right? Then a person could be somebody who is not a lesser vehicle practitioner, but does propound lesser vehicle tenets. Or they could be a person who is a lesser vehicle practitioner and also does propound lesser vehicle tenets. Or the person could be neither a lesser vehicle practitioner, nor do they propound lesser vehicle tenets. Those are all possible. I'm just pausing. And the reason I say that is actually, it makes us think. So I want to pause. What does it mean to be a lesser vehicle practitioner? This is what it's actually, the point of those 4 is that. So a lesser vehicle practitioner is actually an amazing person in many ways, right? It's a person who's given rise to actual renunciation, right? That's what that means. So if you're actually a lesser vehicle, if you're a practitioner on the lesser vehicle path, let's call it that, that means you've given rise to renunciation, right, of all samsara, right? So you've contemplated the nature of suffering, right, and the cause of suffering. You've given rise to the understanding. Actually, you have to understand that it's possible for a person to realize the cessation of suffering, the end of suffering, right? So that person has deeply practiced and contemplated and meditated on the 4 Noble Truths, right? And they've developed a deep aspiration for liberation, right? So that, Lama Tsongkhapa clarifies this, right? That person, like a real person on the path, on the lesser vehicle path, or the Shravaka and Prajika Buddha path, that person spontaneously and naturally, like all the time, wishes for liberation from samsara, right? So they're like an amazing practitioner, right? Somebody who actually is practicing that vehicle. And so one point, so now, and then that's different than a person who propounds lesser vehicle tenets. That means somebody who has studied these tenets and believes in them, and as we said last time, and then expresses that beliefs in some way, right? Or even, we don't have to say propounds, we can say believes in, or the lesser vehicle tenets. And so I want to pause for a moment. Like this first category, a person who is themselves on the Hinayana path but doesn't propound Hinayana tenets. Right? An example of that, according to, I'm going to give an example here. Like according, now that I'm going to say something from the Prasangika perspective for a moment. A Prasangika person would say anyone who, like, actually those who achieve, all people who achieve the result of the Shravaka vehicle, the hearer vehicle, realize emptiness according to the Prasangika view. So from their perspective, right, it's possible that a person could be a Hinayanist in the sense that they're seeking their own liberation from samsara, right? But they could have realized a higher vehicle's view of emptiness. So that person is actually somebody who's realized the path of the Shravakas, but doesn't actually propound the tenets of the Shravakas. They could actually propound the tenets of the Madhyamikas, for example. That's possible. Then it's also possible for someone who, I'll give an example in this next category, who's not practicing or not on the lesser vehicle path, but does propound lesser vehicle tenets. Right? So an example of that would be, let's say, a bodhisattva, right? So a bodhisattva is not on the lesser vehicle path, they're on the great vehicle path, right? But if they come across a student who needs to hear the Vaibashika approach and they teach them that, right, then there's somebody who's explaining or propounding Vaibashika tenets, but they're a Mahayanist, they're a bodhisattva. It's also possible, one text points this out, for somebody like to actually be believing these tenets, but be a bodhisattva. So, and they would have to be a bodhisattva on the path, for example, they say on the path of accumulation is the example they give. So in other words, a new bodhisattva who believes these tenets, but gives rise to bodhicitta. So they're not on the lesser vehicle path, they're on the great vehicle path, right? But they actually would be believing the Vaibhashika tenets at that point in time. And if it's a little confusing, that's okay, but I want to point out what we're getting at here is, what does it mean to be a practitioner of the lesser vehicle versus to hold tenets of the lesser vehicle? And part of what's being implied here is this, is that these tenets, if you look back to the definition, right, a person propounding lesser vehicle or Hinayana tenets, what this is getting at is that these tenets were taught mainly, so the Buddha taught them in the first turning the wheel of Dharma, right, when he taught the Four Noble Truths. And the main audience of these tenets, these tenets, were people who are going to practice the Shravaka vehicle and the Pratyeka Buddha vehicle. That was the main audience, right? And so most of the proponents of these tenets are followers of those traditions, but not all of them, right? It's possible to be a Mahayanist who holds these. It's possible to be and it's also quite possible that a person could be following the, again, as I said, the lesser vehicle path, but hold higher tenets. That's also possible. So, so you can't tell, and I guess that's an important point, right? Because you could meet somebody who, let's say, if you meet a monk who's teaching the Vaibhashika system, right? You could know, oh, they're teaching a system of tenets that's mainly taught by that's mainly upheld by the followers of the Shravaka vehicle, right? Of the hearer vehicle. That doesn't mean that person's not a bodhisattva. Right? You don't know, actually, necessarily. Right? You can't tell that. So don't assume they're not a bodhisattva. Right? And in the same way, just because somebody's teaching Madhyamaka, right, doesn't prove they're a bodhisattva, right? They could be, in their motivation, not a bodhisattva, right? Because, so you get what I'm getting at there? The issue of a practitioner who is a Hinayana or Mahayana or whatever, that's an issue of motivation, of the motivation for their practice. Whereas in terms of tenets, it's what, which group of tenets does a person hold to? Okay. And I'll just briefly say, so it's also positive in terms of those four, right? A person who is a Hinayanist and also does propound Hinayana tenets, that would be, many people have been that, right? Many of the people who taught the Hinayana, who taught Vaibashika, were upholders, were practicing the vehicle of individual liberation, and they were sort of thinking in these ways, and then they taught these. And then an example of somebody who's neither a practitioner of the Hinayana vehicle, nor do they propound Shravaka tenets. Well, actually, almost everyone in the U.S. would be an example of that, right? There is, if you look like, so that's easy, isn't it? Most people we meet are like that, right? They're not practicing any Dharma, actually, right? And they're not propounding any tenets. Or if they are propounding tenets, they may be propounding nihilistic tenets, or the tenets of Christianity, or the tenets of Islam, or the tenets of Judaism, for example. Those, so anybody, so a person, let's take that example, right? A person who's a Muslim would be neither a practitioner of the vehicle of individual liberation, nor would they be expounding the tenets of the vehicle of individual liberation, right? Because they're practicing a different vehicle and they propound tenets of a different religion, right? So that would be an example of that. So I just want to pause and make sure you get it though. So, right, so the main issue here, a person propounding lesser vehicle tenets, right? That's the way he says it. Right? So it's they're propounding tenets of a school of Buddhist thought that was mainly expounded for people who were practicing that vehicle, right? The vehicle of individual liberation.
Dr.
And I'll just, oh, sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
So, sorry if this sounds silly or.
No, all questions.
So I'm practicing. I think based on the tradition I'm following, I'm practicing Madhyamika. So I understand that there's different schools.
Wait, Madhyamika or Mahayana?
Mahayana.
Oh, Mahayana. Okay.
But I also know that FPMT does follow the Madhyamika Satantrika, right? So I understand that the emptiness definitions for those schools, they have a different definition or concept of emptiness. But the practices, I guess from a practice, just the actual practice, there's things that we do. So as someone practicing the Mahayana, there's things that we practice that are similar. So in this different categories, does that make me a practitioner of lesser vehicle? Because I'm thinking of that vehicle as there's some essential steps that they do that I'm thinking we have to do it, or is that the wrong way to think about it? Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that's correct. That you're right. And the way I think the most useful way maybe to think about that is actually the way it's presented in the Lamrim, in the stages of the path. And there, the language they usually use in the Lamrim is they talk about, they have a thing of practices in common with, and then unique practices, right? So they would say like, and so they give example, like an simple example would be meditation on impermanence, right? Would be a practice in common with all Buddhist practice, right? So Mahayana Bodhisattvas meditate on impermanence, Shravakas meditate, Shravaka vehicle practitioners meditate on impermanence, Prajeka Buddha vehicle practitioners meditate on impermanence, even people who want to just have a better rebirth and aren't yet, aren't yet even on the sort of motivation of the Shravaka level, right? So that if you think of the 3 scopes of motivation, they also have to meditate on impermanence, right? And so they would say meditation on impermanence is a practice in common with all of them. You know,
but as a label, just for purposes of label, would I call myself as a lesser vehicle practitioner or no?
No, so like the person, it's like, so if a person is like, let's say the person generates bodhicitta, motivation, and then meditates on that, then that person would be, you could say they're because they have the bodhicitta motivation, they're a Mahayana practitioner at that time, right? Or doing a Mahayana practice, but it's a practice in common with. They would say if you're like, so if you generate bodhicitta and then you meditate on impermanence, then you have a Mahayana motivation, you know, and you're doing a practice motivated by Mahayana, but you're doing a practice in common with the lesser vehicle at that time. Would that make sense?
Yeah, thanks.
Okay. Yeah, other questions actually before I go on? Okay. Okay, so the next part of the definition, right? So we said, so a propounder of, I'll just call it his lesser vehicle, Hinayana tenets. Now it says, who does not assert self-knowers. And so, and I was starting to think about it, like, you know, that phrase, self-knowers, well, we're going to cover that in this module of the basic program. That's covered even more in I think, mind and awareness module in greater detail. But so in brief, some Buddhist, you'll see, we'll learn this as we go along, some Buddhist tenet systems do assert self-knowers and some Buddhist tenet systems do not assert self-knowers. The Vaibashikas do not assert self-knowers. Or sometimes they call it self-knower. There are different translations. It says it in the footnote here. Self-knower or self-cognizer. Those are just 2 different translations of the same Tibetan word. And in brief, what that refers to is a mind, while it's aware of some other object, also being aware of itself. You know, and some schools assert, some Buddhist philosophical schools assert that that the mind, you know, being aware of say an external object, for example, also has an aspect of being aware of itself. So it's self-cognizing or self-knowing. And they sort of, and I don't want to go into too much detail because we'll get to that in some of the other tenet systems, but in brief, they sort of say, some schools argue that must be true because that's how memory works. How can we remember seeing something if we didn't see ourselves seeing it? At any rate, Vaibashikas do not believe that self-knowers, they don't assert that, they don't believe that they exist. So they believe that when a consciousness is seeing an external object, it's simply seeing the external object. It's not seeing, and as an example, it could be seeing also an internal object, like concept. But so they do not believe that there's self-cognizance or kind of ongoing process of the mind being aware of itself as it perceives phenomena. And you're going to see that's one of the factors that differentiates them from the next school that we're going to get to later, you know, the Sautrantika or Sutra followers. And the last of the 3, right? So the 3 elements of this definition. So propounder of lesser vehicle tenets, who does not assert self-cognizers, and the last element, but does assert truly established external objects. And so for them, external objects are truly established. And just pause there. They sound, this school and the next school. So the Vaibashikas and the Sautrantikas both assert truly established external objects. That's one point. And so if you go back actually to the previous page, it says the first 2 on page 2, it just says under divisions at the end, it says the first 2 are also called the two schools that propound truly established external objects. So that's a feature also. I'm going to say that too. So like part of what we're getting at here, and I just want to make a general point now about that, is that a propounder, another way of saying this is that a propounder of, and again, I'm just using his phrase, but a propounder of Hinayana tenets does assert external objects as truly established. Propounders of Mahayana tenets do not assert external objects as truly established. And another way of saying that is that propounders of, I'm just going to say the same thing in a different way now. Propounders of Hinayana tenets assert a selflessness of persons, but do not assert a selflessness of phenomena. Propounders of Mahayana tenets assert both a selflessness of persons and a selflessness of phenomena. So that's a difference between those two types of tenet systems, if that makes sense. So the first two that are considered Hinayana tenet systems do assert a selflessness of persons, right? And particularly they say that there's no, unitary, independent, person, and there's no substantially existent person, and so on. They're saying, or self-sufficient person, and the reason why they, but they don't assert that about phenomena. And you remember, like when we were studying, for those of you who were there, there's a famous, an important line in the Heart Sutra, right? Where in the Heart Sutra, it says, and His Holiness Dalai Lama always emphasizes this line when he teaches it, right? It says, there are different translations, but basically the translation we use said, the five aggregates also are empty of inherent existence, right? And that's a text of the Prajnaparamita, right? Which is teaching a Mahayana tenet system, right? So that one, when it says also, it means it's also of a self, but they're also empty in and of, they're also empty. The aggregates themselves are empty, right? Propounders of the Vaibashika and Sautantrika school do not assert that. They just assert a selflessness of persons. And they don't, so they wouldn't say the aggregates are also empty. They would just say the aggregates are empty of a self, but they wouldn't say they're also empty themselves. That makes sense. They wouldn't say that form is empty of being form, as the Prajnaparamita says, right? They would say, no, form is form, but it's empty of a substantially existent self of persons. So that's a difference. So here, when it says they do assert truly established external objects, that's what's being referred to, is that they don't refute, they don't teach an emptiness of external objects. And by the way, in this context, external objects also include, they also don't, it includes external objects external to our continuum, like a tree or a car or a house, but that also includes your own body and your own mind. They also don't assert an emptiness. They assert that those are empty of a self of persons, but they don't assert they're empty of their own nature, as Madhyamikas do. And I want to just say another comment here. And I should grab my cousin. So what does it mean, actually? I just wanted to say this. So what does it mean to assert truly established external objects? And so we're going to get into that in more detail in a minute, or yeah, hopefully in a minute. But in brief, it means those external objects like matter exist without depending upon the mind or conceptual labels. It also means they exist from their own side, right? And that they exist truly. And that things have their own substance without depending on the mind to exist. So when they say, truly established external objects, that's what that means, right? It has its own substance and it does not depend upon the mind to exist. Obviously, for those of you who've studied Madhyamaka previously, the Madhyamaka school would differ on that, right? Both Madhyamaka schools would differ on that. But this school asserts that. Okay. Next, so that's the definition. Actually, and I'll just pause. Any questions about the definition before I go on to the next category here of our outline point? And we're going to obviously, we'll go more into some of those points, but then it says divisions. And this was sort of, this, again, I don't know, this one I'm not going to go too detailed, but I'll do a little detail here. Because it's interesting that Jetsun Chogi Gyaltsen lists 3 divisions, right? The proponents of the Great Exposition from Kashmir. Kashmir is a region between India, now it's between, kind of in that region between India and Pakistan. It's been an area that's had some, in recent, since, in recent decades, it's been an area that's had some conflict. Then there are the great proponents of Great Exposition from the Western region. And in this case, that refers to Western India, the Western part of the region of India. And then proponents of the Great Exposition from the Central region. And that Central region in this context refers to the area around Bodh Gaya. So, the region where, and that would be the general region where, for example, Nalanda University, monastic university was. So when Jetsun Chogi Gyaltsen sort of speaks in this general way about the divisions of Vaibashikas, he does it according to region and just does it according to 3. I went a little into this, and I'll just say so then there are some who say there are 4, some divided in 4 instead of 3, and then eventually it comes down to 18 sub-schools. So if you really want to be detailed, there are 18 sub-schools. And another point that sort of becomes a bit funny almost is that different scholars assert them in different ways, like how you divide them. So some would say that those, if you take the 3, you break them up a certain way, and other scholars say, no, this one belongs to this category. So I'm not going to get to that level of detail because I don't think that's going to be useful to any of you. But I will say so that, in general, it's useful to know, right? So there are different sub-schools of Vaibhashika. And that's where the definition is important, right? All these sub-schools, according to Jetsun Chogi Gyaltsen and other Tibetan scholars, share those basic common tenets, but then the sub-schools have different various differences between their tenets. They have different scholars who said slightly different things, understood the Buddha's teachings in slightly different ways, but they all have certain general points in common. Another point I wanted to share, though, because this might be of interest to some of you, is so these sub-schools of the Great Exposition, right, of the Vaibhashika, the 18, by the way, all 18 are listed in great detail and sort of what their tenets were and so on in Jeffrey Hopkins' Maps of the Profound, this book, which is a huge book by Jeffrey Hopkins. He lists in detail, what they are. He lists every different, the various different ways that they were subdivided. He lists those. And then he kind of gives what each of their names means, translates the names, and sort of gives some basics about each sub-school. But for our purposes, I thought one thing that would be just worth mentioning is of the 18 sub-schools of the Vaibhashika, I want to mention 3 for a particular reason, 3 of them for particular reasons. And that is this, is that, so these sub-schools go back to very early, in Buddhist history is one point. Soon after the Buddha's passing into parinirvana, there are different stories. I won't go into them. There are different versions of the story of how they sort of form these sub-schools. Some were according to different teachers or different languages or different, there were sort of different stories about that. But they were, anyway, they were all, what's clear and everybody agrees on is that they were all existent quite soon, pretty soon after the Buddha's death, early in Buddhist history. These 18 sub-schools existed. And they were mainly at that time upheld by monastics, right? So monks and nuns in India during those early decades and centuries after the Buddha's passing into parinirvana. And so, and then those schools sustained their own sort of lineages, right? So they had some of their own discourses and so on. But they also then became associated with their own lineages of Vinaya, if that makes sense, right? Because it was monks and nuns who were upholding them mainly. There were also lay people, but the main proponents were monks and nuns. And so I'll just mention three. One of those 18 sub-schools is, as I mentioned earlier, the Theravada, right? Which in Sanskrit is Stavira, in Pali, Theravada. And what's worth noting, one is that, so when we say Theravada, to say all, if you were to say all lesser vehicle practitioners are Theravada, one point is, it's good, this is useful to know, right? That's inaccurate, right? Theravada is one of 18 sub-schools. Another point is in terms of Vinaya, right? Meaning the monastic, and not just monastic. Vinaya means like the code of ethics, right? So it's mainly the monks and nuns vows, but also the layperson vows are included in Vinaya too. And they're the one-day vows. They're sometimes included in the Vinaya. So that tradition, the Theravada, now that Vinaya lineage is the main one practiced in Thailand, Burma, Sri Lanka, Cambodia, and Laos. So that lineage of teachings and that lineage of monasticism spreads to those countries. And when His Holiness talks about the Pali tradition, right, most of that's mainly what's being referred to are these Theravada lineage, lineages that spread throughout South and Southeast Asia. Then another of these sub-lineages of the 18 is the Mullah Servastavadin lineage. And that lineage, right, the Mullah Servastavadin lineage of Vinaya is the one that spread to Tibet and is also practiced in Nepal, Bhutan, Mongolia, Kalmykia, Kalmykia being part of Russia, where the people who had been Mongolian lived there, who are culturally Mongolian. And so, and so again, like when we say, if you say, I sometimes think this also, and it's only Dalai Lama points this out too, but sometimes people say, oh, the Tibetan Buddhists are Vajrayana, as if they're not, but actually, if you look at this, right, they're upholding one of the 18 lineages of the Shravaka vehicle, right, in their monastic code, for example. And they practice that. And they teach it, and they study it for years, right? Some of the monks and nuns spend years studying those teachings. So the Vinaya teachings of that school. So again, that's another point. So the Mullah Servastavadin is one of the 18 that went north and is practiced throughout Tibet, for example. And then one other one that that's worth mentioning is another of these 18 is the Dharmagupta lineage. And that Vinaya lineage still exists also and was passed and is still practiced in Taiwan, China, Korea, Vietnam. And some of you will know, so I'll just mention it because again, some of you have connections like this. If one thing that happened historically was that in the Tibetan tradition, right, the Mullah Servastavadin lineage still has, right, fully ordained monks and novice monks, and then it has, novice nuns, but doesn't have fully ordained nuns, right? That lineage died out historically. It once existed in Tibet, but it died out in Tibet. So there are numerous nuns, some of whom are friends of mine, who wanted to take full ordination, right? And so they couldn't receive that from the Tibetans because that lineage died out. So they went to Taiwan, most of them, and received it from the Dharmagupta lineage, right? So if you talk, for example, Thupten Chodron is an example, right? She's a friend. And she went to Taiwan and took the took Bhikshuni, full ordination, Bhikshuni ordination, fully ordained nun ordination from the Dharmagupta lineage. And so she had like her novice nun vows were from the Mullah Sarvastavadin lineage, right? That had come from Ling Rinpoche in her case, the Dalai Lama, so it's Dalai Lama's senior tutor. But then when she wanted to take full ordination as a nun, she couldn't receive it there. So she went to Taiwan and received it from the Dharmagupta lineage. So those are three lineages of the 18 where their Vinaya traditions are still alive and very much practiced. I was sort of checking, those are the three I know of. I'm not sure if others of the 18 still have Vinaya lineages that exist. I couldn't find evidence of that, but I'm not sure. These are the three that I know of and that are are mentioned usually. So I don't know if they're like some forest monks or nuns somewhere who uphold some of the others or not. That I don't know. But these three lineages of Vinaya still exist. So going back. So anyway, so there are 18 different subschools. We will go into a little bit of some of the details of those, of one or two of those 18, but we're not going to, we're not going to study all 18 in detail, of course, because that's beyond the scope of Jetsun Chogi Gyaltsen's text, to be honest. Because his text is fairly brief, right? That's why Jeffrey Hopkins in this book goes into detail, because it's called Jamyang Shepa's Great Exposition of Buddhist and Non-Buddhist Views, right? So he goes into Jamyang Shepa goes into great detail, whereas Jetsun Chogi Gyaltsen is giving a more general presentation of these sub-schools. Any questions about that heading before I go on to the next one, which is the etymology? Okay. So next is the etymology. And I know, by the way, I just want to pause. I know this is a little, I mean, we're hopefully it's relevant, but we're going to get more into the philosophical sort of some of the practice stuff in a couple of headings. Actually, next heading down is next after this one. But this one is actually important too, so I'll just say it. So the etymology, right, of the Great Exposition School. And here it says, why are they called proponents of particulars? So what they're doing is an etymological analysis of Vaibashika as meaning proponent of particular, or one translator called them particularists, which I think was a funny phrase, but yeah, particularist or proponents of particulars. And so he gives two reasons why they're called that. The first is, he says, one historical and the other philosophical, in a sense. The historical one is, he says, they are called such because they propound tenets following Vasumitra's Great Exposition of Particulars, the Mahavibhasa. And these all alternatively, and I'll get to that one in a second. But so he says one reason they're called Vaibashikas, or well, you can see the Vibhasa, right, in Vibhasa, in the title of his text. Vibhasa is connected to Vaibashika etymologically, is what Jetsun Chogi Gyaltsen is saying. And so I wanted to give a little point about that, which is, so so there's this, he's referring to a text there, and he's saying they follow this text. And I was sort of looking this up because I couldn't remember it. But so historically, what they're getting at is this, is around the time of the Buddha, a group of arhats wrote a text called the Seven Knowledges, which is Abhidharma text. And what was important, when they say particular, I was like, why do they call it particulars? And apparently what they were getting at there is, some people were reading the whole, like, vast sutras, right? Like, for example, all these different sutras, the actual sutras of the Buddha. But when these arhats wrote this text called the Seven Knowledges, what they did was they took out particular points from different sutras and systematized them to help people understand. And so rather than studying, the people who were sort of studying those, rather than reading and studying entire sutras, were studying particular points. So they used this phrase Vibhasa, particular. And then Vasumitra wrote apparently a humongous, very long text, this text called the Exposition of Particulars. And that text actually was not translated into Tibetan. So the Tibetans don't study that text. Apparently, I read that it was translated into Chinese, so it still is existent. But the Tibetans didn't actually get that text. But Vasubandhu wrote his commentary, the Abhidharma Kosha, in part based on that text. And Tibetans spend years studying the Abhidharma Kosha. Many Tibetans. Khensa Rinpoche, Lobsang Jampa spent years, for example, studying the Abhidharma Kosha. And so the Abhidharma Kosha would be an example of a Vaibashika text that's studied by many Tibetans. And so, and it goes back through this idea of particulars, right? And if you actually read, the Abhidharma Kosha, and that's in English, and commentaries on it in English, it's explaining many particulars, right? It's explaining what are the 5 aggregates, what are the 18, what are the sense spheres and the sense objects and the, all these different particular points. And so you can see that's one way of understanding proponents of particulars. And on that, I just want to give one other side comment, which is, it's amazing, isn't it? Because we all know, right, that all the Tibetan traditions are practitioners, right? Going back to my point earlier, right? You can be a practitioner versus a proponent, right? We all know this. All the Tibetan traditions are practitioners of Mahayana, right? They strive to develop bodhicitta. Right? And I sort of made a joke last time, which was a true joke. It was also true, but right, that it's easy for us to think, oh, I want to study Madhyamaka, because it's the highest, and I want to study highest Yoga Tantra. I was making that joke, because I'm very high or something, right? And then you look at like someone like Gyume Khenso Rinpoche, right, who spent years studying the Abhidharma Kosha, right, which is according to the lowest of the 4 tenet systems. And he spent years studying Vinaya, which is according to also Vaibashika, right? So Gyume Khenso Rinpoche spent many years of his life studying those 2 topics, which are both Vaibashika presentations. And his motivation would have been Mahayana, right? He would have cultivated bodhicitta, but then he spent years studying these topics because they would help him understand the Dharma. And so, so I just want to say that again, it's a good reminder that if we think, oh, I'm somehow better than that or something, it's a mistake, and it's not only, and Khenso Rinpoche is of course a practitioner of Gelugpa tradition, but if you look at the life of, say, Mipam, who was Nyingma, he spent years studying the Abhidharma. Various Karmapas spent years studying the Abhidharma. So it's not unique to Gelugpa either. All the traditions, and the Sakyapas also studied the Abhidharma Kosha. So all the Tibetan traditions study that text. So it's not, it's a mistake to think it's like not profound or useful. It's very profound points. And then, so that's part of the etymology. And then the other part of the etymology, the other way of doing the etymology that Justin Shogi Gelsen says is, or alternatively, they are called proponents of particulars because they propound the 3 times to be particular instances of subjects. And actually, pause. If you read or hear that sentence, it's hard, isn't it, for the meaning of it to dawn in your mind? Like if you just read that, it's like quite difficult, right? They are proponents of particulars because they propound the 3 times to be particulars of substances. And what this is getting at, first of all, it's connected to the fact that they, as I said earlier, do assert truly established external objects. And to put it briefly, what is this getting at? That they propound the 3 times to be particulars of substances. And what it's getting at is this, is that according to them, so to say this right, although I'm trying to say it the right way, although gross external objects, first of all external objects change, they're impermanent, but what they say is the entity remains. And I'll give an example of what they mean by that. So that the entity of external objects remains in the past, present, so the 3 times are past, present, and future. And then the external object itself changes, but the entity remains. What they mean by that, they give various examples of that. One example they would give is they would say, if you had, say, a gold jewelry, right? A person had gold jewelry, and then they melted it down, and it was like a mass of gold, right? And then later, a statue maker turned that gold into a statue of the Buddha, right? Well, at one point it was jewelry, at another point it was a hunk of gold, and another point it was a statue. So it changed, but in all 3 times it was gold. And so they would say the substance, so when it says substance, right, the substance, goldness, existed in the past, exists in the present, and will exist in the future. That's their sort of example. And they give another example. They say, they give another example where they say, if you watch like when a seed is planted and it becomes a sprout, right? They would say, well, there's some entity there, that was, if it was like a, say, a wheat or something, right? It was barley, it doesn't use barley, so it was a barley seed, right? That there was some entity of barleyness to the seed, and then as it became a tiny sprout, it was still a bar. It looks different. It's a different. It appears different, but there's some substance, right? That it has the nature of barley. Its entity is barley, right? So the seed was barley, and the little sprout is barley, and then it gets bigger. It's still barley. So it changes over time, but the entity and the substance of it is remains in the past, present, and future. And they give another example. They give example of like a young girl who grows up and gets married and becomes a mother, right, or something like that. And they say, well, it's different, right? And there's the young girl is not a mother and wasn't a wife, and then whatever, wasn't married, and so on. So there's something that person has changed over time, but there's some entity there there is that is recognized by people, right? You can see, so somebody who knew her says, "Oh, I knew her, when she was a little girl, and now I remember when she was that age. Now she has children that age. Oh, how wonderful!" That there's some recognition of a kind of something that has remained, some substance that has remained over time. And so their view is that, so when they say particulars, it's that things have their own particular nature, which abide through the past, present, and future. And one thing I'll point out, just to reflect on this point, is it's kind of interesting, isn't it? Because on the one hand, if we've studied Madhyamaka, then immediately you would say, if you're thinking of a Madhyamaka perspective, you would say, well, that's ridiculous, right? It's not true. And yet, at the same time, what's interesting, if you really think about this point, right, is think about how you relate to your house or your office. Right? I see this lately with my office, right? Because I don't go there very often these days. I go once every few weeks to get the mail. I'm not going there because of the pandemic. But I have some idea. It was my office 10 years ago. It's my office today, and it'll be my office, at least till August of next year. So that's my lease rental. And it feels like that. It feels like there's some substance from its own side, independent of my mind, that make it. And they're saying that's right. They're saying, yes, things do exist that way. Marjorie,
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Okay, so earlier you said that they believe that body and mind are external. So I can see that with the body, it's a material substance, and that entity might remain because it decomposes or something. Now, how would they say mind? What are they thinking of as mind having an entity? They don't mean the brain, right? They mean the mind.
Yeah, and you'll see actually in the next section we'll get at that. But what they say is that they're how to say it right? That there are moments of awareness that are not subdividable in a sense, that are sort of these discrete moments of awareness that are, I'm just see actually how there's a way that they actually, a phrase they use, temporarily partless moments of consciousness. That on the next page it says that. Temporarily partless moments of consciousness is the way they think of it. And so they say those temporarily partless moments of consciousness are substantially existent and have their own nature from their own side, and are kind of intrinsically what they are, and have their own substantial existence as a moment of consciousness that's not dividable, and that anyway, we'll get into more detail about that. But that's the way that's the basis for them of what I think you're asking about. Does that?
Yeah, it gives me. I mean, I'll have to ponder it a little more, but I get it. Thanks.
Yeah, but that's how they look at that. Yeah. Oh, and just to clarify, like I think I didn't say it clear. It's not also that they're saying that consciousness is external exactly. What they're just saying is that it's a phenomenon, and that it has that it's truly established. But they're not literally saying consciousness is external to our being or something like that. They're just saying that they would say, but it's truly established, a phenomenon that's truly established. Lynn, you have a question?
I've been sort of working on the premise that all the traditions thought that the I was non-existent. The I was not truly existent. But this seems different than that.
Yep.
Is that right?
Yeah, we'll have to think very deeply. Yeah, like not, because in other words, you'd have to really think, what does truly existent mean? You know, and that you have to think, because they're very careful, right? They say, you know, in a gross way, they say there is no permanent, unitary or singular, independent I. That they would say. And they would say there is no self-sufficient, substantially existent I. But that's their subtlest presentation of selflessness. So, but they don't say there's no I. They don't say there's no person.
What's left?
And I think that's a great question that we're gonna, I want to actually suggest that as we go through these different schools, your question then, what's left, is something I want to suggest we all contemplate together on each school, actually. Because there's gonna, there is, you know, and if we, when we can answer, if you can yourself answer that question from your own contemplation and go, oh, what's left in the Prasangika school is this, but what's left in the Vaibashika and in the mind only, well, you can really experientially go like, get it, like, oh, wow, the mind only school has this left, the Vaibashikas have that left. And then, you know, there is, then we gain a different understanding, in my view, of what the Prasangikas are actually saying. So we really have to analyze carefully what's left. I think that's a great question. And I think as we go through their tenets, hopefully you'll be able, like, if you can, what I want to suggest is that we should come back to that question once we go further through their tenets, that we really contemplate together. So what are they saying? You know, when they're saying there's no self-sufficient, substantially existent self, what does that mean? And what's left that is substantially self-existent? Does that make sense? They're asserting there are things that are self-existent and substantially existent. You know, a Prasangika asserts there is no such thing.
Well, in your example of the young woman and then the wife and then the mother, I mean, those are all things that which are, you know, conventionally we think of as inherently existent. But I view the practice as negating that, I guess.
And that's really important. This school does not negate inherent existence. It negates substantial existence, and it negates self-sufficient existence, but not inherent existence. And I think what we're coming up against is like, this is great. In other words, if this is the, you know, I often say this point, if I love this idea that if, you know, like, that if we want to, I was just experiencing it last night when I was thinking about some of these topics, where it's like, if you want to become more wise, you can't be comfortable. And if you want to stay comfortable, you can't become more wise. You know, and it's like this idea of like, what in the world is substantial existence that's different than inherent existence? And they're quite different according to these schools, actually. And that's what I'm getting at is like, and it's like, if we can't experientially, both intellectually and then in some experiential sense, get what it intellectually means, and then eventually what it feels like, then we're not going to correctly identify the object of negation in the Prasangika school. We'll end up with what they call it too broad or too gross an object of negation. So we've got to understand those differences. And that's part of what's being gotten at here, is what's being negated in self-sufficient, substantially existent, which is their subtle version, is different than what the Prasangikas are negating. And we've got to really understand the difference. And it's not easy to understand that difference sometimes. Yeah,
I'm curious if the Jeffrey Hopkins text, the large one, covers non-Buddhist schools as well, because I'm really confused right now about the difference between Hinduism and the first two schools, particularly the Advaita philosophy. And I don't want to muddy the waters, but I'm really not seeing how, like, I feel like Buddha parted from Hinduism, and now I feel like we're completely back in Advaita philosophy or very close to it. So, and I don't want to take us, way off course here, but just that's my personal source of confusion right now.
Oh, I think it's a great question. I'll say a few things. One is, I'll say a few comments. One is, there were times actually recently as we started going through this text where I was sort of feeling personally a little, what's the word? I was wishing that that FPMT had chosen a text that included some of the non-Buddhist schools of philosophy. I think it'd be a much longer course, so I get why they chose Jetson Cho. Well, I think they chose Jetson Cho Gelson partly because he's Sarah J and the Sarah J organization, but connected to Sarah J. But also, I think they wanted it to be fairly brief and all that. But I was kind of wishing that because I was like, oh, it's fun to actually look at the non-Buddhist schools. And to answer your question, Jeffrey Hopkins, first of all, his text, Mass of the Profound, let's see, actually, the first, his goes through many different, the first 190 pages are, is the introduction and non-Buddhist schools. And then also Daniel Kozord and Greg Preston translated Buddhist philosophy, Losung Kunchok's short commentary to Jamyang Shepa's root text on tenets. That also covers non-Buddhist, in a briefer way, non-Buddhist schools. That's two. And a third one that covers non-Buddhist schools, I put it away, is Geshe Sopa translated, and it's part of the, it's part of this series, the Library of Tibetan Classics. This is not the book though. But Geshe Sopa, before he passed away, he translated, it's a Tuken, I forget his last name. The first name of the author, of the Tibetan author is Tuken, but I can't remember the rest of it. But anyway, he is part of that series. And he translated a text called something like The Crystal Mirror of Philosophical Somethings. And that one covers, that one's really quite interesting. It covers non-Buddhist Indian schools of philosophy. It also it briefly covers these four tenet systems. It then looks at philosophical differences between the Nyingma, Kagyu, Sakya, and Gelugpa. And then it looks at other philosophical tenet systems from China, for example, and other parts of Asia. So it's a kind of unique book. So there are quite a few books that cover non-Buddhist philosophical tenet systems. But yeah, and so yeah, it'd be nice, wouldn't it, if this text covered more of that? But it really just, this one just starts with the Buddha. Whereas all those texts, they first have, the first section is non-Buddhist, then they get to Buddhist. Whereas this one doesn't have that. But yeah, no, it's fun to read those, and they do get at the differences between different schools, tenets. Yeah. But other question. Is there time? Yeah, there's a little time. So maybe we'll just start on the next section then, because that was the etymology. And now it's good to start on this because then it'll be something to contemplate in between. So the fourth of the 7 outline points is their way of asserting objects, which we've started to touch on already, right? And so they say the definition of a thing is that which is able to perform a function. And then they say thing, existent, and object of knowledge are equivalent. And again, I'm going to do this like, I'll blame Jody now because she said go into the difficult points. But I could just skip over that. But I'll say a few things there. So we're good. It's gonna, we're going slow, but I think that's okay, right? It's not a hurry. There's a whole field of study. There's a whole topic called the unique tenets of the Prasangika. But one thing, where there are certain points that are unique to the Prasangikas. But actually, each school has its unique tenets, right? That's what makes it unique. That's what makes it a tenet system. Otherwise, it wouldn't be its own system. And this sentence, thing, existent, and object of knowledge are equivalent, is a unique tenet of the Vaibashikas. because other schools of Buddhist philosophy, right, they just said a thing is that which is able to perform a function, right? And perform a function means it's like a, what's the word, that it's part of causal relatedness, causal mechanisms. So here they're saying all objects of knowledge then are things, right? That when it says are equivalent, right? Thing, existent, and object of knowledge are equivalent. What they're saying is all objects of knowledge are things, therefore all objects of knowledge are able to perform a function, right? Now, one thing I just want to point out, and this is, I don't know, maybe a little too esoteric for some of you, but I will just say it and you can not worry about it if it's too much. But other schools of Buddhist, other tenet systems would say, well, negative phenomena that are known through negation don't perform a function. So like they would say, for example, an example of what are examples of things that are known through negation, right? Space, right? As a non-obstructedness, space in general. They would say that doesn't perform a function in the sense that it doesn't produce, like it's not like a sprout that produces a seed. It's not like a, whatever, like that. Vaibashikas say space does perform a function. It allows things to move. Whereas other Buddhist philosophical schools say that's not performing a function. It's not a causal relationship. That's a kind of, it's a negative phenomena. It's a negation. It's not a positive phenomenon that's performing a positive function. So that's a philosophical difference. I remember Jeff Nye once asked about that, where we were studying another philosophical tenet system. It said, it said space does not, that tenet system said space does not perform a function. And Jeff sort of said, well, that doesn't make sense. And actually the Vaibashikas would agree with that. The Vaibashikas would say that doesn't make sense. Of course it performs a function, right? Also, like, another phenomenon, right? In other words, an object of knowledge is selflessness, right? Other schools would say selflessness does not perform a function. This school says it does perform a function. It's a thing. Selflessness is a thing, right? Another example is cessations, right? Other schools would say cessations are a negation, right? The end of a certain thing, right? Or the non-existence of a certain thing. Those schools would say those don't perform functions. This would say they do. So it's a unique tenet of this system. Another general point I just wanted to mention in reference to this sentence is, and this is actually one I've thought about many times. So I just want to share it to think, just as something to think about. It's not something Jetsun Chogi Gyaltsen mentions explicitly. But in Buddhism in general, this is not a unique tenet now, but in Buddhism in general, right? Look at that definition, right? Object of knowledge, right? So existent things and objects of knowledge. It says those are synonyms, right? And I just want to raise this question, like, I think this is a difference also, like in Buddhism in general, existent things are objects of knowledge. Right? And is that how you think of what exists? Right? And I remember one time actually, I think Sujata was there. One time I was at Vajrapani and somebody was pointing out, like somebody gave I don't know if you were there for this one or not, but somebody gave the example. They said, well, if there's like a meteor somewhere deep in outer space and nobody, it's like nobody sees it, does it exist? Right? And I think that's just worth thinking about, right? Like there is, according to Buddhism, like ordinarily, I think, I'm not sure that non-Buddhist tenet systems think that way, right? That existent things are objects of knowledge. Buddhism asserts, even Madhyamikas assert, existent phenomena are objects of knowledge, or that which can be known. Right? And what is that? And actually, I'll just point out one more thing. That means something different. I was reflecting on this last night. This is where I was going to go, oh, wow. Is according to this school, to be an existent thing that's an object of knowledge has a different meaning than what that would mean in the Madhyamaka school, of course. Because in this school, I'm giving you the example of the meteor, right? This is a tangent, I know, but in this school, they would say Well, that meteor has a substance, right? Particles within it that exist over the past, present, and future, right? And it exists from its own side, so and it can be known, so it exists, right? Whereas I was actually thinking about the other day, a Madhyamaka would say, if you asked them, if you saw a meteor that had never been seen before, and you asked the Madhyamaka, did it exist before you saw it? Right? They would say, and then the person said, if you said, the Madhyamaka might say, well, where did it come from? You say, well, it came from this quadrant of space. Here's the trajectory, right? And you would say, the Madhyamaka would say, well, yeah, you just labeled it as existing in the past, right? So it exists in the past through the power of your conceptualization of a past meteor, right? That you just conceptualized. That's not what this school would say, right? This school would say there's a substance there. So there's two different things, right? But in both cases, they would agree that it's an object of knowledge, right? And that therefore it exists. That's interesting. Yeah. I think it is Paul, by the way. Yeah. But Lynn, you have a comment?
This doesn't, it doesn't seem to answer like science does, and we do also, people outside of science, if you reconceptualize things, they change conceptually into something different. So would you say they didn't exist? Well, they're not a thing before because we didn't see them the way we now conceptualize them, because everything is really according to the paradigm that we're looking at it through. So if it looks different than 100 years ago, was it not a thing 100 years ago because we didn't call it a thing? We didn't conceptualize it separately. It was still there, but we just didn't conceptualize it.
Well, actually, what do you mean by it was still there? That's interesting, right? Like when you say it was still there, what do you mean?
Like, take something easy, racism. Racism has lived with us, at least in this country for 600 years, well, whatever. But we didn't see it for a long time. White people didn't see it. Let me put it that way, okay? And so we see it in a different way now than they did 100 years ago or during the Civil War, but that relationship has always existed. So it's just seen differently. So would you say it wasn't a thing before?
I'll point out, which is, again, I just think it's worth thinking about, different, again, just using your example, right? Different Buddhist philosophical schools would answer that question differently is one point, wouldn't they? So, and again, it's the same thing, right? So I'll start with a Madhyamaka could easily say, well, of course it exists. Of course it existed 600 years ago. You just said, it's like, whereas things exist in the past conceptually. So you just conceptualize it existing in the past. It exists in mere name, right? You just named it as existing 600 years ago, so it existed 600 years ago. Unless somebody can validly say it didn't. If they could disprove that, right? But otherwise it did. That would be a Madhyamaka answer. But how would this school answer? Actually, I'll pause and ask you, how would this school answer that? Maybe we're not far enough into the school, but to think, how would a Vaibashika answer that question?
Well, because they see time as past, present, and future, it would not have been a thing for probably for Buddhists, but for some segment of people 600 years ago, but it would be today.
That's a really interesting question. I just want to suggest, let's keep thinking about that from a Vaibashika perspective, because it's easy to answer. For me, it's actually easier to answer that from a Madhyamaka perspective. But it's really, it's interesting to try to contemplate that question from a Vaibashika perspective. Actually, let's just keep contemplating that, if that's okay. I just want to keep, I could say my own theory, but I actually think it's worth contemplating it together, because the point of this is not to get the right answer. The point of this is to really contemplate these points and ask those kinds of questions and keep thinking about them and they'll help us understand what the Vaibhashikas are getting at, how a Vaibhashika would view phenomena.
I have a question about the way in which Vaibhashikas determine. So I'm wondering about whether or not they do the valid cognizer analysis in any way, because the racism thing, I mean, which I think Lynn beautifully pointed out, right, is it was to some people and it wasn't to others. I think that if you asked people 600 years ago whether or not racism existed, there were surely people who said that there were, right? Yeah. And so of all races, right, there were white folks who said that too 600 years ago. So now so the valid cognizer thing, I think, is tripping me up on this particular thing versus like the comet that nobody knew about coming into is a little bit easier actually for me. So that's where a part of it's getting jumbled in terms of, do Vaibhashikas do the valid cognizer, other valid mind negating or affirming the existence of a thing.
Yeah, and that's what we'll get to. Actually, section 5 of the 7 is the way of asserting object possessors, which are valid cognizers, essentially. And we'll get into that. So they have, valid cognizers and non-valid cognizers, and what are the categories of valid cognizers. And they're actually one of the main systems that assert those things. So yeah, we'll get into that. And that will, I think, help answer this question, is what I think we can, if we think of these questions from that perspective, when we get to that section, it'll maybe be easier to answer those questions. What is a valid cognition and what's not a non-valid cognition?
Well, can I ask another question?
Yeah.
Excuse me, the idea of a mental image being a permanent thing. For instance, I met a woman once, and so immediately an image about her different aspects sprang up in my mind willy-nilly. And later, I learned that she was a veterinarian, and I could feel my opinions of her changing. So that was a permanent image that then, so the question is was that a permanent image that then got replaced by a new permanent image? And is that what they're referring to when they talk about something not existing before as opposed to existing now and in the future?
Interesting question. One thing I'll say briefly, Paul, is that, just sort of pausing to make sure I remember this correctly. My recollection, which is that, I was just reading something the other day about this. Like, so in general, that idea that, what do you call it? Generic images or mental images are permanent is usually taught, particularly by the Sautantrika school. That's an important teaching from a Sautantrika perspective, is one thing. So we'll get to that more when we get to the Sautantrika school. And part of what the Sautantrika school is getting at when they say that is this idea that their idea, which is that we come to generic images or mental images through a process of negation, and that therefore they don't. And so one point they're making when they say permanent, when that school says permanent, is that they're not saying that they exist forever unchanged. What they're saying is they don't change instant by instant. That's the Sautantrikas, that's what they're saying.
Right.
And so I don't think the Vaibhashikas assert that in the same way as the Sautantrikas. I think they have a different way of describing that. But from a Sautantrika perspective, I think what they are saying would be that, you could sort of have this image and then it's not changing instant by instant, but then it can be changed at some point, and then it's a new one that again may doesn't change instant by instant. That would be the Sautantrika's perspective on that.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Dr. Lang?
Yeah.
So well, in the Vaibhashika, then are they saying function is the one that function is the thing that exists in past, present, and future? Is that a correct way of? So the substance, the past, present, future exists in a barley, even though it changes in form. Its essence, its function exists in that past, present, future. Is that how you would?
No, I think what they're saying, I don't think they would say the function does. What I think it say is because if you look, it's able to perform a function. And the reason why I say differentiate. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, no, go ahead.
Okay. Well, what I
I'm
was
just
saying
trying
is
to
like,
distinguish is when you say substance, which I'm thinking is essence. I'm just using the word essence in my mind, but its basic essence is there. Is that the same as the function, or do they think that the function would still changes in the past, present, and future? Is that a correct way to think about it? Because you mentioned function and
I think it's important to differentiate between what the function is and the ability to perform a function in order to understand it correctly. And what I mean by that is this: let's take the example of like. I'll use an example like let's use gold, right? That's the one I used earlier, right? Like so, or a piece of metal. Let's say just a piece of metal, right? Like so, metal is a thing which is able to perform a function. But then it's important to differentiate. So it's a thing in that it can perform a function, right? But the function itself doesn't exist over the past, present, future in the sense that, like that same piece of metal. Let's say it's a piece of metal that's existed, in human society for centuries, and at one point it was like a part of a sword that performed the function of killing, and at another point it was melted down and it became part of a bowl that could then perform the function of holding liquid, and then it was melted down and it became part of a doorknob that could perform the function of opening a door. So the function itself doesn't exist over the past, present, and future in the sense that the function can change. It could have a different function at different times. But the substance, it's metal. According to them, the fact that its substance is metal exists in the past, present, and future. And the fact that it can, therefore, is a thing that can perform a function exists over the past, present, and future. But what the function is may change at different, and does change at different times. So you have to differentiate, like it's a thing that can perform a function. That is true over past, present, and future to them. But what function it performs can be different at different times. So the function itself may be one function at one time and a different function another time, and so on like that. Does that make sense?
Yes. So in that sense, it can change in label or perception. I'm just relating it to Lynn's question of the race because it's more subtle in that the existence of racism in the past can be in a different form, but does it exist in substance? But it could have been labeled differently with a different function. So how is it the same? So it's not the same.
I'll just say one last point.
Getting confused. Sorry.
I know we have to stop in a minute. So I want to give one thing just to contemplate on relation to that point that you just raised, Cynthia, that also Lynn raised. And again, just from this school's perspective for a moment, right? Like, I think what you'd have to do to get an answer from this school's perspective is you'd have to define racism more. If in the example Lynn used, you'd have to define what is racism, right? And what I mean by that, because we didn't get too far into this yet. I mentioned it, but right is what's let's just say right. Is it a conventional truth? We're going to get into this next class, but is it a conventional truth or is it an ultimate truth? But I'll give an example. Like I said earlier, right? A moment of consciousness that's temporarily, how did I phrase it? I want to make sure I phrase it exactly the way they do. Ultimate truth is a phenomenon, a temporarily partless moment of consciousness, right? And so I would raise the question, like, in other words, what's interesting for them, right? Like in this school is, I'm not saying this is racist. We have to define what is racism in part. But I want to suggest, if you were to, I'm not suggesting this is racism, but if you were to define racism as a moment of hating someone because of their race. What's interesting is from this school's perspective, I'm just giving an example, right? If a person in 16 whatever, you know, in the 1600s looked at another human being and hated them in that moment because of their race, that is an ultimate truth, right? That moment of consciousness is an ultimate truth. And it's, you know, and it's substantially existent. And it existed no matter what. And so from this school's perspective, if you were to say that, if that's the definition of, I'm not saying it is, but if that were the definition of racism, then you would say, in some sense, that that exists no matter what. You know, it exists from its own side. It's inherently existent. You know, so if you were, it depends on, like, so there is, if you define racism as a kind of, it's different, right? If you define racism as looking at a person and hating them because of the color of their skin, then from this school's perspective, that's substantially existent, inherently existent, intrinsically existent, and it existed no matter what anybody says. On the other hand, if you were to define racism as, like, you know, I don't know, some other way, you know, a sort of a concept, you know, that's contingent on culture and time, then that's a different question. So you'd have to kind of think what is, so I guess to answer, that's what I'm getting at, is from this school's perspective, you'd have to really define what is racism. Is it a moment of consciousness? Is it a physical object? Is it, which I think will be hard to assert personally, but that racism is a physical object. But you see my point there is, like, to really answer the question, this is why I was getting, you know, it connects to what Sujata said about valid cognition, but it also gets at, is racism a conventional truth or an ultimate truth? And then which, depending on which you say, what is it exactly? And then you can answer that question from this school's perspective. But we're running over, so we should do our dedication. Anyway, hopefully it was thought-provoking. I just want to encourage you to keep thinking about these topics, and then we'll get more into them, you know, as we get into the ways of asserting objects next time. But let's do our dedication. The supreme jewel, Bodhichitta, where it has not arisen, may it arise and grow. Where it has arisen, may it not decrease, but increase more and more. In the snowy mountain paradise, you the source of good and happiness, all-powerful Chenrezig Tenzin Gyatso, please remain until samsara ends. And thanks, everybody. It's fun to study this together.
Thank you, Lauren.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Lauren.
Stay safe,
You too.
everybody.
Mm.